Hello, my name is Jacob Tonson, and welcome back to the Wisdom of Odin. A few months ago, I traveled to Finland for the first time to meet the band Noidoin, and we made an amazing video discussing paganism and Finnish spirituality as it survives today, and particularly from the 1850s onward, because this is when the mythology of the Finns was actually written down and recorded. But while spending time in Finland, I also was doing research on the ancient history of Finland, as it goes all the way back to the beginning of time, or at least human history from what we know. And so the history of Finland is something that most people don't know about. The Finnish mythology and the Finnish history is really tied closely to the Scandinavian. Things such as Mjolnir are very similar to Ukko's hammer, and so you're going to see a lot of things come together, and I think you're going to find a lot of things that maybe benefit your practice now, or at least just enlighten you about the ancient past. And so I hope you enjoyed this video taking a deeper dive into the history of Finland, in particular when it comes to the ancient history around the spiritual practices. The history of Finland goes back about as far as the rest of the northern world because the Ice Age. So the last Ice Age ended around 11,000, 12,000 years ago, and it's around this time that we start seeing the people of early Finns migrate into the territory, because at one point this very flat land was covered by ice, covered by these glaciers, and so the southern parts of the country that we know today started receding, and so we have lots of lakes, lots of rocks, and lots of flat land. And so this is the land that most people still live in today, whereas a lot of people really don't live in the north of Finland. In fact, the majority of the population of Finland live in Helsinki still to this day. And so a lot of our historical areas that we look at as far as artifacts and people have done research on come from these southern regions, namely into the east as well, which is the Karelian region. And this is also where the mythologies still survive as well. But the Karelians are really like very Eastern. They're very connected to Russian culture and history as well. And then there's a commonality with the Estonians as far as the mythology. So it's, again, kind of complicated where we're getting some of this information. So just understand that it's not exactly black and white where our archaeological information comes from or the origins of this information. There is evidence to suggest that Neanderthals actually lived in Finland. Now, this is something that has been kind of disputed. As far as I can tell, the information says that Neanderthals lived in a cave in Finland, I believe on the middle of the west coast. If I remember correctly, the site is actually called Wolf Cave. And if this is true, and Neanderthals actually did live in Wolf Cave in Finland, it would push back what we understand about people living in Finland, or at least humanoid people, going back 120,000 years. That is absolutely insane. And this would also be the northernmost site, I believe, of Neanderthal activity. And so this has been a highly debated subject for a very long time, and not all scholars agree whether or not Neanderthals actually did live in Wolf Cave. So when looking into people migrating into Finland after the rescinding of the Ice Age, there is a really old artifact. I believe it's a net. I'll put up a picture for you here. And this is the oldest fishing net ever found in the world, dating all the way back to around 8,000 BC, I believe. So really cool. I mean, human history, again, has been existing in Finland for a very long time. The other artifacts you're going to see in the very early days of Finland, in the Stone Age, leading into the Bronze Age or the Neolithic era, what you're going to see is a lot of, flint arrowheads, small little carvings. But one of the more interesting things that you start seeing going into the Bronze Age, we start seeing more animal-like figures or little humanoid-like figures that were clearly carried as personal totems. And so while this could have been a toy like we know today, these little figurines may have actually called to some kind of ancient religious practice as far as keeping some kind of animal totem, spirit of the household, ancestor spirit, deity. We really don't know, and we would never know unless we had a time machine and could speak the language of the ancient Finns. But regardless, it is interesting to see objects like this, because normally all you do find in this era is things such as flint arrowheads, bowls, pottery, and so they're not necessarily things that give us a lot of information about the religion of the ancient past. And so to see something like these little figurines, it is exciting to see that there was some kind of totem practice maybe in the ancient past. So moving further into the Bronze Age as we get closer to that, so really on the edge of the Stone Age into the Bronze Age, we start seeing the rock paintings of Finland pop up as well. Dating these things is quite difficult because it's really just the rescinding of the water levels that are used to date these. So the date range on these, I believe, is about 5,000 years, whereas scholars think that these were made. So it's hard to say whether or not it was made in the very early days or the very late days. It's hard to say. But regardless, the rock paintings of Finland are something I've talked about briefly on this channel before. I have a whole video on them if you want to explore it. But essentially, there are over 100, I think over 150 sites across Finland that feature rock paintings that still exist today. The primary painting implement of this was iron oxide, or mixed with egg, mixed with blood, and sometimes mixed with in water and a few other things that left it pasty on rock walls. I've only been able to see one of these sites for myself, and it is very faded. And so it's just one of those things that if it isn't preserved, they are going to fade away into time. But the fact that they weren't rediscovered until 1911 and they survived thousands of years, possibly 10,000 years, that's absolutely incredible. And they do feature, again, a very rich look at the ancient spirituality of these people, because they are probably spiritual in nature. These weren't just, people were drawing for fun. These had meaning, these had purpose. And the figures that we see are very reminiscent of the figures that we see in the rock carvings of Sweden and Norway and Denmark. You see very humanoid-like figures with animalistic properties, including the animals themselves, spirit boats. And so you see a lot of really interesting things that call to possibly a shamanic past. And that's one of the things that a lot of people are interested in when it comes to the ancient history of Finland, is that they more than likely were a shamanic-based culture, and you can see that a lot in their art and their artifacts that survive from the ancient past. So when moving into the Bronze Age, there's sadly not a lot to talk about here besides a few artifacts that do survive. Usually with the Germanic people or the Celtic, we can talk about things such as source material as far as things written by the Romans, but we just don't have that here. The Romans do mention the Finns briefly, but not to any detail that gives us any clue of who the Finns were. And then again, we see more of the similar artifacts from the Bronze Age, some weapons, armor, jewelry, things like that. And we continue to see these little clay idols pop up as well, more things calling to the shamanic history. It isn't really into the Iron Age that we start getting some more evidence to look at, and there's some absolutely beautiful examples in the Iron Age in Finland. And something I really want to pay respect to is in the Finnish National Museum. There's absolutely amazing sliding display. It's essentially you grab this little screen and you slide it across the wall, and wherever the year, because it's a dated line, and whatever year you fall onto, you will see like what artifact was made in that time. You also see, I believe, the population of Finland as well. It's a really cool machine to see all the individual artifacts from Finland and the dates that come from. So absolutely love that display. The Iron Age of Finland can be broken down in a few sections, so I'm just going to kind of run through those for you and the main points coming from the Iron Age in Finland. So at first we have the pre-Roman period from around 500 BC to 1 BC. And what we know about this is that the Finns started to trade a little bit. They were starting to trade more down into the Baltic region, into Latvia and Lithuania, and they were starting to trade more with Scandinavians. We still don't have a lot of written source material at this time. Again, very little mentioning of the Finns, but we do know they are trading slightly with their neighbors. During the Roman period of around 1 AD or CE to 400 CE, we do see some trade with the Romans because there are Roman artifacts that have been found in Finland. While we don't have that written source material to really back up much, we can say that the Romans were at least getting some of their goods up to the Finns in some way. And around 400 CE to 575 CE, we have the migration period of the Germanic cultures from Germany. So the spreading of the Germanic culture up into the British Isles with the Anglo-Saxons, and then furthermore into the Scandinavian countries, we do see a lot of commonalities in the way people dress in Scandinavia, and we can see those commonalities as well with the Finns. A lot of the folk dresses and culture is very similar to the Scandinavian, and this is possibly because of these Germanic connections in these earlier days, despite the language difference between the Finns and the Germanic language-based countries. It is during the Merovingian period of 575 CE to 800 CE that we see trade routes run even deeper from Finland. And this is also when we see fortification become more of a thing. There are more hill forts that pop up and more protected settlements that pop up around the coast because these trade routes were starting to make money. Anytime you have money begin to come in, you have protection because people are going to want to secure these trade routes for themselves. It's also during this period of expansion of trade in Finland that we see the Viking Age become a problem, because some of the first people raided by the Vikings before they even raided the British Isles were the closer neighbors of the Finns to the east. And so many Swedes came and raided Finland, as well as Danes and some Norwegians. And so we started seeing this wealth become targeted by these early Viking raiders. It is during this Viking Age period that we do start to see a lot of the commonalities pop up as Finns began to trade more with the Scandinavians, and as the Scandinavian Vikings began to raid more. As Scandinavians were buried in Finland with their artifacts, with their grave goods, we start seeing commonalities such as the Mjolnir and Ukko's hammer become very similar and become part of people's everyday wear and be part of these grave goods. As you've been seeing in this footage, a lot of these artifacts in the Iron Age in Finland, you take an untrained eye, or people even with a slightly trained eye, a lot of these Finnish artifacts look very, very similar to the artifacts of the Scandinavians during the Bronze Age. And I do think that's because we're seeing more and more crossing of cultures, both peacefully and violently. So obviously with the Merovingian period into the Viking Age, we do see a booming of culture of Finland, a booming of production of iron works and other metals and precious items. So it's during this time that we also do see a lot more religious-based items as well. And there's an amazing room in the Finnish National Museum that is, again, something you can see the commonalities between, or at least the filling of the gaps between the Scandinavian belief and the Finnish belief, because this room literally has Yggdrasil, and it's labeled as Yggdrasil. And all the objects in this room are displays of spiritual objects of the Finnish people. And this is where I think this is interesting for people that are interested in Norse paganism, because what this room is saying is that there are connections between Norse belief and Finnish beliefs, because you have Yggdrasil in the center of this room. And yet the artifacts in here are almost wholly unique to the Finnish people, because the majority of these artifacts in here belong to an early shamanic class, or whatever they were called at this time, but people that believed in an animistic religion and the connection of nature all around them. In particular, when it came to animals such as the bear. There is an amazing display of the bear cult items for the things that people held as sacred. And again, the conversation that I had with Noiduin, with Yemina and Henry back during the Finnish spirituality video, bears still have a very prominent role in the culture of Finland today as their national animal, but also as something that has been part of folklore ever since the country has existed. And so you see this going all the way back to this late Iron Age with these bear claws, with the bear stones, the mask. It's really cool to see all these artifacts calling to the shamanic past. And the bears were not the only animals that were held as sacred. There was many displays, including deer, and then there was something with birds and ducks or swans, all these important components of the very late Iron Age, but then we see that same commonality with the Finnish mythology that was recorded in the 1800s by Elias Lönnrot, and then as they still survive in Finnish culture today. A fun note in here is that in my explorations of history, you often see penises everywhere because the Romans were very fond of the phallus. They were wearing it around their necks as a good luck charm. They were literally putting it on the side of columns. And so you see a lot of dicks throughout history, namely because of the Romans. But again, because I believe the Romans had very little influence of Finland, you don't see any of these penises in display here. What you see instead are these rocks that very much look like vulvas, very much look like vaginas. And so it's really interesting because they literally are just little stones that look like vaginas. And so, what did this mean? I'm not sure. I know one of the things that Yemina was telling us when I recorded this Finnish spirituality video is that if a woman comes across a bear in the wild, the way that she can scare away the bear is by lifting up her skirt and showing her vulva, because the bear would be scared. Either by its power or by the sight of it. So, women's magic may have been something that was held as very sacred to the Finns of the ancient past. It's hard to say when it comes to the written source material of the Kalevala that survived in the 1800s, because there was very little women's writing in there, and it seems like it was still recorded with a very masculine lens. It was recorded by a male, by talking to other men, and so the women's role seems to have been lessened throughout history and Christianization. But these stones may suggest that the women's role in society, at least spiritually, was very significant. On the less sexual side of talismans, there were a lot of trinkets and talismans here, more so than just the Ukko hammer. If you look at a lot of these artifacts in these display cases, many of them were necklaces or charms for the wrist, or just things to have on the body. And so this idea of having charms for different things, whether it was good luck or protection or getting rid illnesses or disease. This is something that was obviously very common to the Finns and something that was held as very sacred. So that is an interesting look. We may not know much about the rituals performed in the past, but we do know now that they were very superstitious when it came to charms and talismans. And obviously they were using some form of shamanic practice, in the ancient past, to heal people more than likely, to connect to the animals, and to see nature in this reverence. I mean, anyone that's actually been to Finland, it's mostly forest even till to this day. It's rock, wood, and water. And that is all of it. It's everywhere. And then, of course, I haven't mentioned this video, iron is a very important component to the ancient Finns. We see this in the Kalevala and the written source material. And then, of course, we see that with the rock paintings that were used using iron powder. But iron is a very important element to the ancient Finns and their spiritual beliefs. So I know I'm very excited about these commonalities between the Scandinavian beliefs and the Finnish beliefs and the culture and the artifacts, but I do want to note here that this isn't a definitive answer. This isn't something that is completely 100% true. Something that could happen, and probably has happened, is because we know so little about the ancient Finns because of the lack of written source material, particularly when it comes to their mythology. The gaps have been filled by Scandinavians, because most of the people that wrote about early Finland, when it came to the history, when it came to the mythology, when it came to the culture, were Swedish, because Swedes have had a very strong hand to play in Finland's development, because I believe they were conquered by the Finns for some time. I'll put the answer here if they were, but they were, even the signs, like to this day, you go to Finland and the majority of the signs are all in Finnish as well as Swedish. And so, I know a few translations of the Kalevala and other works were first in Swedish before they were ever in Finnish. And so a lot of Scandinavian-focused things were probably also recorded as well. And so if they were seeing these things about the ancient religions, and they were like, well, clearly it's like the ancient religions of Sweden, and so they just put it in there. Sorry to my Swedish friends.
No.
That was horrible. But I think that's what happened a lot in cases. So there could have been commonalities, but those commonalities have definitely been put together more by Swedish scholars over the last few hundred years. So we're getting pretty close to the end of this video. We have a few more things here to cover. I just wanted to say, if you're enjoying it, please make sure you like and subscribe and all that good YouTuber stuff. There's also a join button down there below in case you are interested in joining as a channel member. I also have a Patreon. Truly, these videos would not be possible to make without the amazing support of people across the internet who choose to support me financially. So thank you all so very much for those who choose to support this channel. I have no other sponsors. It's just me. There is no cameraman, and I am the editor and the researcher. So anything you can do to help means so much, even if that's just liking and sharing when possible. So with that, we do have Christianization to talk about. So let's talk about the Northern Crusades. The Northern Crusades were something that a lot of people don't know about, because we know about the Crusades to the Middle East, but there was this Northern Crusade. And there were 3 Northern Crusades, I believe, into Finland. The first one is kind of, maybe it happened. No one actually knows. It may have been made up or mythological sized. But regardless, there were several attempts by Christianization, mainly Catholicism, to penetrate into Finland and convert the heathens. Mainly this was done by Sweden and Denmark, more so Denmark when it comes to Estonia. The really interesting story of the First Crusade is possibly completely made up, and more than likely is, because no one can actually verify if this actually happened, but it was the main propaganda piece that was used against the Finns to get them to convert. And this is the story of Henry of Uppsala and Lali. And so this story, as it was told to me, because there are many different editions of the story, so I'm just going to tell you how it was told to me, because this is how stories are transmitted. And also the problem with stories is because depending on who tells you it, it's going to change. And so me, as the pagan, is going to tell you the pagan version of the story. There's also a Christian version. So the pagan version of this story is that Henry of Uppsala was on a mission to convert the Finns, and he had his party of missionaries who were very peacefully going around and stealing and robbing from people. And so he comes to Lali's house, and Lali is not home, he's out for a hunt, and Henry of Uppsala says, hey, we need room and board, you're a hospitable person, accept these missionaries and feed us and house us. Lolly's wife tells them, no, I'm not going to feed you because you're trying to convert my country. And so what Henry of Uppsala does is he raids the house and takes what he wants and feeds him and his merry band, and they leave. And so they steal from Lolly and his family. Lolly comes home and his wife tells him, and Lolly is very angry. And so he decides to hunt down Henry of Uppsala. In the middle of a frozen lake, he confronts Henry of Uppsala and kills him with his axe. And so the main thing that changes here is that the Christian story, this is the good version, is that after raiding Lolly's house, Henry of Uppsala did leave money for Lolly and his family. He still forcibly took the things, but at least he left money. And then oftentimes the pagan or the Finnish version of the story is that he did not leave any money, he just took what he wanted and left. Regardless, the story more than likely never happened. There's no evidence to suggest that this was an actually real account of something that happened in Finland. But regardless, it was taken up by Christian arms and used as the main story of conversion of how devious the heathen was and how poor and kindly the Christian vision was for the country of leaving money when you take something from people. And so this can still be seen a lot across Finnish culture is in very Christian areas or Christian sigils or seals. You'll see a bishop's hat and an axe representing this story. So it's clearly a very important part of the early history of conversion, and it's more than likely a complete lie. This is something that I've talked about on this channel before, particularly when it comes to St. Olaf. St. Olaf never did anything miraculous in his life, but upon his death, the church decided to make him a martyr and give him many aspects of the Norse gods, including Freyr and Thor. And so people would more easily transition over to Christianity because they had this St. Olaf to look up to in a very similar way to they did Thor and Freyr. And so in the story of Henry of Uppsala and Folly, I think you have a very similar thing here as a story was made up or very exaggerated to push for conversion. So through, of course, the propaganda, the First Crusade, Second, Third, much like I'll talk about in the Baltic regions in upcoming videos, is the conversion, the Northern Crusades were a very violent one. So after propaganda failed, after peaceful missionary work failed, it moved very quickly to aggressive forms of conversion, such as kidnapping, murder, of course, pillaging and stealing, and holding people hostages. And so conversion definitely became violent. So eventually the majority of Finns did adopt Christianity, but it fell off quite quickly. And I believe a lot of these folk customs stayed around for a very long time. I think a lot of the things, particularly when it came to the bear spirits, the animals, nature, all these things kind of stayed put with people. And very clearly, the stories of the early Finns and the mythologies, particularly with the Karelians, was something that was maintained. Because when Elias Lönnrot in the 1800s decided that he was going to record the national epic of Finland, he went out to the east, to the Karelian region, and he interviewed essentially shamans, and they still had these orally passed down stories of the Kalevala and the stories of Vainamoinen, Ukko, Mielikki, and all these other deities associated with Finland. And so the 1800s saw this national pride rise up, and Finland started to gather its idea and its culture. And it's really around this time that we start seeing Christianity fall off. To this day, the latest number I could see is that around 30% of people actually still believe in God. While so many people might belong to the church, only 30% still believe in the Christian God. Whereas I believe it's closer to 50 or 60% believe in some kind of universal life force, as they put it. And so I think after talking to the Finns, their belief system is not very organized. It's not something that you kind of, put with the government and you figure out and you build a church. It's not really one of those things. It's a very, very nature-based thing, a very personal thing. And so while there are a lot of Finnish things and Finnish customs that may call to this ancient spiritual past, the people that practice the spirituality of Finland today mostly do so in private, mostly do so in the forest. And be sure to check out Noidwin's work, who I'm sure I've been putting in this video because I absolutely love my time with them and I want to see their music travel far and wide because the spiritual beliefs of Finland and its people is absolutely wonderful, and I hope you've enjoyed this look at it in this video here at the Wisdom of Odin. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video discussing ancient religions from around the world.